So just awarding, there are going to be photographs of suffering people and victims of atrocity in this presentation. The Indonesian War of Independence was fought between 1945 and 1949. It ended 3.5 centuries of Dutch colonial rule and resulted in Indonesian independence, just north of Australia. The conflict had begun in August 1945 with the capitulation of the Japanese military to Allied forces at the end of the Pacific War. It ended in December 1949 with the transfer of Dutch sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia. The conflict of the intervening years was and is viewed on the Indonesian side as a war of independence. On the Dutch side, war was never officially declared. Instead, military campaigns were, up until recently, and I'm talking the last 2 or 3 years, euphemistically referred to as police actions to restore peace and order in what was then the Netherlands East Indies. Guerrilla fighting characterised most of the conflict, with atrocities committed on both sides against civilians as well as combatants. 3 research institutes in the Netherlands have begun documenting and publishing on these atrocities. And just a few days ago, the Dutch government, at last, after 67 years, has conceded to an independent inquiry into these events. Now, Dutch journalists, museum curators, and even the Dutch government are beginning to follow historians who've been working on this for much longer in acknowledging the conflict as a colonial war. General Simon Spoor, who oversaw the 2 so-called Dutch police actions, the first in mid-1947, the second in late 48, early 49, informed Dutch troops in 1947 that their role in Indonesia was not to punish but to protect, and I'll return to this quote later. The idea, and up until recently the photographic image of Dutch involvement in the conflict as a humanitarian mission rather than a colonial war, has been remarkably resilient in the post-colonial era, bolstering an international reputation of the Dutch as having been relatively good colonisers. At this point, I want to turn to the French theorist Roland Barthes, who held in 1980 that, quote, "the private life is nothing but that zone of space, of time, where I am not an image, an object. It is my political right to be a subject which I must protect," unquote. And I want to use that to think about personal photography, which is often discussed as family photography when it comes in an album for some reason. And my view is, in fact, that feminist scholarship and recent historical studies of colonial photography, and particularly the private or family album, disprove the notion of the private sphere as this zone of exception, where everyday banalities override the articulation of political subjectivities. On the contrary, amateur or family photography developed in the early 20th century as a rich medium for constituting social selves with reference to a wider, indeed globalising world. Amateur photography enabled growing numbers of ordinary people to visually document their lives in ways that had formerly been the preserve of elites. Importantly, far from being mute historical documents, recent archival research that I've conducted and will soon be extending for my larger project on colonial photography and images of suffering and disaster shows that amateur photographs taken by Dutch soldiers in Indonesia connected to important public visual cultures within the military that confirmed particular views of the conflict. These images have taken more than 60 years to reach a general public because they were omitted from the contemporary news media. But there was hardly a silence or a blackout, as I prefer to say, on these images. They were widely distributed within a significant subculture, numbering around 100,000 men, the biggest military conflict the Netherlands has ever committed to this day, and to some extent their families and friends. In examining the personal albums of Dutch soldiers in this paper, I conceive of these as autobiographical primary sources or ego documents that contain insights into the evolution of a significant late colonial discourse of liberal imperialism on the Dutch front lines. The notion of the Dutch as ethical or humanitarian rulers and fighters in the Indies, particularly as regards their role towards civilian populations. Soldiers on the Dutch side of the conflict were encouraged to make records of their wartime experience. And this is one example from a recent set of about 50 albums that is held at the Centre for Holocaust, Genocide and War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam. There are a lot of examples of this kind of album, and it actually says memories of my service period overseas. So it's as though it's some kind of travel diary, and in fact it often takes the format of a travel diary. Soldiers leaving the Netherlands, going through the Suez Canal and then onto Indonesia. So military authorities issued blank photograph albums for soldiers so they could boost morale on the home front. This was important for justifying the involvement of young men, 20, 21 years old, from the Netherlands, which had just emerged from the German occupation in 1945, as well as those who were Indies-born and had survived the Japanese occupation in the Indies and often time in a prisoner of war camp. Much of the literature on humanitarian photography and its audiences focuses on the extent to which images prompt public action. Soldiers' albums were never made for this reason. They were made for more specific audiences, family at home in the Netherlands and other soldiers, rather than a large public. They were not meant to move others to action in the sense that photojournalists' work is supposed to. So the albums show what I argue is an incomplete but significant window into what the Dutch soldiers preferred to depict themselves as already doing. The ways in which they'd internalised and rationalised military and government directives as to their roles in Indonesia, and their interpretation of a conflict in which they, of course, played an equal role as partners in violence. The records they've left had a significant impact on the politics of memory around decolonisation in the Netherlands up to the present. So I'm just going to give you two examples today. The following slides that I'm going to show are images from one of 6 albums made by this man, Albert Henry Oswald Bos, a Dutchman born in the Indies in 1906, who served through both police actions as a lieutenant in the Koninklijke Landmacht, or the Royal Army, which was mostly comprised of volunteers. I don't understand why he was there since he was Indies born, but it was mostly volunteers who came from the Netherlands. This album I'm about to show was made during the time of the second police action, so December 48, January 1949. And the striking thing about this is that Bos pasted a series of 17 photos across 6 pages, each bearing a caption with this indignant refrain, which you can see down the bottom, and it translates to, "This is the population under the Republic." He means the Republic of Indonesia, which was declared in 45, but not accepted by the Dutch until 49. This is the population under the Republic. Civilian women and children are shown in various states of abjection, starving, emaciated, clothed in rags, diseased, their flesh bearing gaping lesions from yaws, which is a tropical infection of the skin, bones and joints. It had been treated with salvarsan since the early 1900s and was beginning to be treated with penicillin from around 1945. Dutch soldiers are present in 7 of the photos, mostly to encourage villagers to expose their injuries more clearly to the camera. An important thing to note about these photos is that they're taken by multiple soldiers. Bos is not the sole author. I've looked at thousands of loose photos as well as about 60 albums, and it was common practice for soldiers to make many copies in a company and then share them with each other and swap them. And you can see evidence of this in the albums and in their loose photos, and photos often went into military and veterans publications. So the idea of personal photography in this social group and subculture is from the outset already a misnomer. Bos's photographs of Indonesian suffering and his accusatory caption, "This is the population under the Republic," suggests a disastrous outcome to the interruption of the colonial ethical policy, proof that a self-ruled Indonesia was unable to deliver on its promises of modernity. And I'll explain the ethical policy. There's more pictures. Always the same caption. So the so-called ethical policy was official government doctrine in the Dutch East Indies from 1901 until 1942 when the Japanese occupied. It involved rolling out elementary healthcare and education on Java and to a lesser extent the other islands, as well as improving rural prosperity through infrastructure and irrigation. And these are photographs that are taken in the 1920s that show the founding of Indigenous clinics to treat diseases like yours and also to give vaccinations against smallpox and other common epidemics. The presence of Dutch soldiers is figured in Bos's albums as an emergency intervention to resume the basic tenets of the policy to provide health, welfare and prosperity. That Dutch forces were partly responsible for creating conditions of deprivation by blockading Republican-held areas goes unremarked in these images. Instead, the photographs figure soldiers, here Bos and his comrades, as witnesses of an atrocity of neglect committed by the Republicans against their own people. And as I'll show in a moment, soldiers also photographed evidence of atrocities committed by retreating Republicans against civilians in villages. There are some really horrible photos which I'm not going to show you. I made a choice of which were the least troubling. These two types of images of suffering go together and overpower blackouts on the violence that Dutch soldiers also, we know used in the course of their fighting. Dutch soldiers show themselves as agents of humanitarian intervention, an identity entirely in line with the propaganda issued by the Dutch military command in the Indies and communicated in the Netherlands through the press. At the onset of the first police action, these are the words that Spoor pronounces, how the Dutch troops should comport themselves. To bring war, not to bring war, but freedom. They're not conquerors, they're liberators. They come not to punish, but to protect. And the personal albums of soldiers like Bos show the last and arguably most forceful visual representations of the colonial ethical policy enacted in the history of the Netherlands Indies at the moment when the colonial state was collapsing. Those sorts of images that show soldiers as humanitarians are staples in many soldiers' albums, but also in military publications. Commemorative volumes, for example, on the first police action in 1947, came out within months of the end of that operation, really quickly. And they drew on photographs that the soldiers themselves had taken. And then there are memoirs that are written by men who served in particular battalions. And they show these photographs of starving children, particularly, and civilians being given the rations of Dutch soldiers. And sometimes these really strange contradictions then of, where's the button? Showing them on the same page as military operations that are clearly being carried out. So, importantly, it was hard to show what happened during an action, police action. These other kinds of photos were photo opportunities, if you like, to show soldiers doing something without either disrupting a dangerous operation or showing dead and wounded or showing them inflicting violence on other people. So another example, this is from the album of another soldier, J. Nieuwenhuizen, who was a soldier like Bos who served in both actions. And his personal album extracts a larger collection of photos that he made for the Netherlands Indies Government Information Service and the Marine Information Service, in other words, colonial intelligence and propaganda organisations. Many of his photographs document in forensic detail atrocities committed during the Persiap period in the late 1945, early 46. When British command was transitioning out of Indonesia and Dutch troops were taking over, when 3,500 Europeans and Indo-Europeans were massacred by Indonesian pemuda or youths, with another 16,000 missing and never identified. Scholars are still debating whether a genocide took place in this period. So Nieuwenhuizen was involved in investigations surrounding the recovery and identification of civilian victims, particularly Europeans and Chinese. Some of these photographs he placed in an album, numbered according to his own system or with file numbers from his intelligence work still attached. So this is a personal album of photos that were made to report to military and intelligence photographs, but he held back copies of some of those photos and then made a collection for, I don't know what, for himself, for some reason. The photos he took of Protschky victims focus on sites where mass graves were discovered, on the distinguishing features of badly decomposed bodies, and on injuries that suggest cause of death. All provide evidence of atrocity committed by Indonesians against Europeans and Chinese. Mutilations, live burials, strangulations, and other atrocities. I think one of the captions provides a small insight into why Nieuwenhuizen took the trouble to compile an album. The caption says, "See the strangulation cleft in the neck of this European woman." An urge perhaps to extend his private witnessing to others, to entreat some unnamed audience, maybe other soldiers, colleagues in the government, or maybe his own troubled self, to look again. The album also shows atrocities of neglect and willful destruction committed against Indonesian civilians, particularly in the village of Kamal on Madura. And this image has already recirculated on the cover of books that are actually about things that happened during the Japanese occupation. So it's been taken out of context because it's this really perfect image of the suffering child emerging from this destroyed village. Nieuwenhuizen's typewritten captions explain the conditions of dead and living victims of starvation. So this one, for example, at the top, you can read those for yourself. And this one, which talks about the destruction of a once prosperous village. This one, a woman on the brink of death, who is given rations by Dutch soldiers. And then this one of children who've gone blind from malnutrition. And the interesting use of the word close-up in English, not in Dutch. So, as the Dutch historian Paul Bale has demonstrated, the photographic documentation of suffering and possibly orphaned Indonesian children and the simultaneous elision of any Dutch accountability for their status by recourse to blaming rebel Indonesian forces first occurred in 1904 during the Aceh War. Here, rather than take responsibility for the massacre of villagers during a subjugation campaign in the Gayo and Alas lands, colonial military authorities and commentators in the Indies and the Netherlands figured a paternalistic Dutch colonial state as a better guardian of these miners than their own parents who'd placed them in harm's way. So these photographs that show colonial soldiers positioned around a fortified village that civilians had retreated to, and then they've massacred hundreds of people in that village, and the one surviving person is this little child that you can see here, and the soldiers actually have themselves photographed and that photograph circulates in the Netherlands in public in 1904 and is discussed in the Dutch Parliament. But the interpretation of the photo was not, we have perpetrated an atrocity against civilians. It is that these people put their children in harm's way and should have just surrendered. In Nieuwenhuizen's album, a redemptive end to the suffering of the civilian population is narrated through captions, all captions. Captions are really important in spinning the meaning of these photographs for a lot of soldiers. It's narrated through photos that show the transformation of fear, hunger and sickness to joy and relief with the Dutch resuming command, which was actually the caption that shows, that goes, that's what that says. The Dutch resume command as they roll in their tanks. In foregrounding Indonesian civilian victims of the war, Bos and Nieuwenhuizen's photographs, and the photographs taken by many other soldiers, and the photographs that circulated in military and veterans publications, present these victims, I would argue, as the flawed citizens of the Republic. And here I'm following Ariela Zule, who argues that colonised people depicted as vulnerable to disaster are often implicated in its causes rather than its effects. Bos's caption to a range of civilian grievances, "This is the population under the Republic," makes the same subtle accusation. He suggests the promise of Indonesian citizenship made to the population when Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed independence from Dutch rule in August 1945 was a deceit. Their assertion of sovereignty failed to secure the conditions of bare life for the people. The better alternative, by implication, is the regime that can, the Dutch regime. So this is the continuation of that narrative. Clinics which give aid to civilians as well as to injured soldiers, women lining up for food, and look at the top there's worried, and at the bottom they're smiling. This last album is pre-war. It's pre-both wars, Japanese occupation and Indonesian War of Independence. It's 1928. It's taken by a colonial official. He's sort of a medium-ranking official, a Dutchman, who serves some 15 years as a civil servant in places like Borneo, Aceh, and Sulawesi, and he is an adherent to the ethical policy. He produces 12 albums and lots of loose photographs during his career in Indonesia, and is a prolific writer. And so I can reassure you from his writings, some of which are published and many unpublished, that he believed in the ethical policy, in liberal imperialism and welfare for Indigenous people, up to a certain point, under Dutch tutelage. And his personal albums are full of pictures that show the Dutch building roads and bridges, the opening of hospitals in his area, children receiving primary education, no further than that. Primary education is enough. Markets prospering, all pictures that show the rollout of the ethical policy. Some of them he puts in his personal albums, and some he uses to illustrate reports to his superiors in the government. So there are already amateur but borderline kind of in discussion within very small but powerful publics, amateur photographers photographing ethical policies in the 1920s and even earlier. So these Dutch soldiers' photographs explicitly collapse two aspects of the colonial era ethical policy together. First, the high ideals of Indigenous uplift espoused by Dutch intellectuals, journalists and technocrats, which were at the rhetorical forefront and the physical frontier of the policy. Second, the brute force underpinning the program, the expansion of Dutch police and military powers after 1901 to pave the way for progress throughout the archipelago by ensuring what the Dutch always referred to as rust and order, or peace and order. This two-pronged approach, subjugate and civilise, had effectively been in place since the late 19th century when the Aceh War commenced around 1870, and was evident also in the 1920s in the strong state response to nationalist and communist uprisings in Java and Sumatra, which saw the establishment of concentration camps for Indonesian political prisoners in places like New Guinea, for example. But in the colonial period, before the 1940s, there'd always been a division of labour between those who did the subjugating and those who did the civilising. Not so in the late 1940s, when Dutch soldiers depicted themselves at the vanguard both of restoring order through military police actions and of reinstating the mandate for Dutch rule by tending to the humanitarian needs of an abandoned population. I want to talk briefly about post-colonial interpretations of these photographs. As the Indo-Dutch activist historian Pamela Patanama has recently argued, colonial-era personal photography taken by Europeans in the former Indies had a significant impact on shaping public discourses of the colonial past in the Netherlands, particularly in the 50s and 60s, right after the war, in the near absence of any other public discussion on the subject. There was an atmosphere of shame around having lost the Indies, and so the soldiers, similarly to the Vietnam War, it's often referred to now as the Dutch Vietnam War, soldiers were not really encouraged to talk openly and to commemorate their role in the war in the 50s and 60s. That took some activism and happened later. The dominant effect of the images of personal images and personal photography from sort of the pre-war era in the public sphere has been to produce what Paternoster calls bittersweet collective memories of the colonial past in the Netherlands, recollections tinged with loss and nostalgia. And they're built around evidence of all the good that the Dutch were doing and how appreciative Indonesians were of it. Such representations of the past have been remarkably durable, surviving the first serious criticisms of Dutch actions in the War of Independence, which happened in 1969 during the televised confession of a war veteran named Joop Huting. He said that he'd witnessed and participated in atrocities against Indonesians and that other Dutch soldiers had seen and done similar things. The controversy stimulated what was actually an earlier government inquiry and a report, the so-called Excessennota, or memoranda on excesses, which found that excesses, and the report refused to use the term atrocities or war crimes, had occurred during the war, but were exceptional rather than systemic. A steady stream of historical investigations since '69, since the so-called Huting affair, have challenged the Excessennota, but it's taken until now for a breakthrough with the Dutch government commissioning another independent inquiry. Now, my paper is situated in the context of these debates over controversies concerning what did or didn't happen during the late 40s. My aims here have not, however, been to extend an evidentiary base for atrocities committed by the Dutch or even by Indonesians. And that's where new photographs that have been circulating in the public sphere in newspapers, for example, and very recent museum exhibitions have turned to images, very quite rare images, but images nonetheless that show Dutch soldiers carrying out summary executions, putting Indonesian prisoners under duress and other kinds of atrocities. So they're now circulating as evidence to prove that the Dutch did commit atrocities on a wider scale. I'm not interested in adding to that, in finding extra images by looking at soldiers' albums of atrocity, and I have found them. But I kind of think that's beside the point. I'm looking at images that show the ideological frameworks adhered to by Dutch participants in the war and the way they translated into soldiers' ways of recording what they did photographically and what they didn't record, and that bolstered this very durable resistance to accommodating the idea in the Netherlands of the idea of Dutch soldiers fighting a dirty conflict. The ego documents that soldiers made during their colonial war reinstated the legitimising discourse of the ethical policy and were premised on a decades-long lack of recognition for the political nature of Indonesian opposition to the paternalism of that vision. What was new about the photos made by soldiers in the Indonesian War of Independence was, on the one hand, their reluctance to show their own atrocities, a departure from colonial practices that had celebrated victories no matter what the cost, as recent as 1904. So that doesn't happen anymore in the late 1940s. And then on the other hand, the military's appropriation to itself of the ethical work that in the colonial period they had left to the technocrats who followed in their wake. So, by way of conclusion, these albums show that it is not just photojournalists who historically have been involved in the roles of witnessing atrocity. The photographs of Dutch soldiers in the Indonesian Revolution show how complicated visual economies of humanitarian disasters can be. They are highly selective representations of the violence of wartime, especially the image of Dutch involvement in the conflict as an ethical intervention that transformed the colonial civilising mission into a legitimising mission for the biggest challenge Dutch authorities had ever faced to continuing their rule, and which they lost. They also arguably show, and this is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to deal with, I'm just going to open it and leave it. They also arguably show the foundational moments of what would rapidly become a post-colonial developmentalist interpretation of Dutch colonialism after the transfer of sovereignty to Indonesia in 1949. Thank you.